Literaturpalast Audiospur. Geschichten aus Südosteuropa. Präsentiert von Traduki. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich zu dieser Ausgabe der Audiospur, in der ich mich heute, und es mag zunächst ein wenig ungewöhnlich erscheinen, mit der in Finnland geborenen und seit vielen Jahren aber in Frankreich lebenden Journalistin und Dokumentarfilmerin Taina Tervonen unterhalten möchte. In unserem Gespräch wird es vor allem um ihre Reportage Les Fossoyeuses, auf Deutsch Die Totengräber, aus dem Jahr 2021 gehen, in der sie über einen Zeitraum von mehreren Jahren die Arbeit von zwei Frauen in Bosnien begleitet, die für die ICMP tätig sind, die Internationale Kommission für vermisste Personen. Das Buch ist nun im März 2025 in der Übersetzung von Patricia Klobusiczky im Wiener Zsolnay Verlag auch auf Deutsch erschienen. Und zwar unter dem Titel Die Reparatur der Lebenden, Zwei Frauen in Bosnien-Herzegowina auf der Suche nach den Ermordeten des Krieges. Liebe Taina, ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie die Zeit gefunden haben, mit mir über Ihr Buch zu sprechen. Ich sende liebe Grüße nach Frankreich. Hallo.
Hello.
Und Taina Tervonen spricht ein kleines bisschen Deutsch, wie man auch in ihrem Buch erfährt. Unser Gespräch werden wir doch auf Englisch führen. Meine einleitenden Worte zur Autorin und zu ihrem Buch gibt es im Folgenden aber noch auf Deutsch. Taina Tervonen wurde 1973 in Finnland geboren, verbrachte ihre Kindheit und einen Teil ihrer Jugend als Tochter einer Missionarsfamilie, aber in Namibia und im Senegal. Zurück in Europa studierte sie, pendelnd zwischen Finnland und Frankreich, Translations- und Literaturwissenschaft. Nach ihrem Studium entschied sie sich dann für ein Leben in Frankreich. Hier ist sie seit etwa 25 Jahren als freie Journalistin für französische und finnische Medien tätig und arbeitet zudem als Autorin, Übersetzerin und Dokumentarfilmerin. In ihren Texten und Dokumentationen beschäftigt sich Tervonen mit ganz unterschiedlichen Themen, mit Migration, queerer Elternschaft, Postkonfliktgesellschaften, Schriftstellerinnen des globalen Südens oder aber mit der Rückgabe afrikanischer Kulturgüter. Häufig arbeitet sie gemeinsam mit FotografInnen, zudem konzentriert sie sich immer wieder auf langfristige Projekte. Dies ist auch bei der Reparatur der Lebenden der Fall, eine Reportage, in der die Autorin Beobachtungen und Gespräche aus knapp 10 Jahren einfließen lässt. 10 Jahre, in denen sie wiederholt nach Bosnien-Herzegowina gereist ist, ein Land, das sie vorab kaum kannte. Vor Ort setzte sie sich mit den Nachfolgen des Bosnienkriegs auseinander, vornehmlich mit der noch immer andauernden Suche nach Vermissten, die Kriegsverbrechen zum Opfer gefallen sind. Dafür begleitete sie 2 Frauen von der International Commission on Missing Persons bei der Arbeit, Senem und Daria, die wie alle weiteren Personen im Buch nur mit Vornamen genannt werden. Senem ist als forensische Anthropologin für die Erkennung nicht identifizierter Leichen zuständig. Daria beschäftigt sich als Ermittlerin mit den Hinterbliebenen der Opfer, nimmt Blutproben, führt lange, schwierige Gespräche. Tervonen beschreibt in ihrem Buch sehr akribisch die alltäglichen Arbeitsschritte und Aufgaben dieser 2 Frauen, erklärt alles genau und bis ins kleinste Detail. Auf diese Weise wird nicht nur ersichtlich, welche Herausforderungen und Probleme mit der Suche nach den Vermissten verbunden sind, es wird auch deutlich, wie wichtig die beschwerliche Arbeit der 2 Frauen und ihrer KollegInnen ist und wie viel Hoffnung sie den Überlebenden geben, die seit Jahrzehnten darauf warten, endlich ihre Angehörigen zu finden und beerdigen zu können. Okay, now we'll switch into English again.
Hey.
Taina, I'd like to start with the most obvious question. You are a Finnish journalist living in France, but you have been interested in the Balkan region, especially Bosnia-Herzegovina, for a very long time now. Over a period of 10 years, you made many trips there and not only wrote your book, Les Fossoyeuses, about it, but also filmed documentaries about this region. How come you are so interested in the Balkan region? In the book, you write that you actually knew very little about Bosnia-Herzegovina before your first trip.
Yes, I became interested in this region, it was coincidences. I think a lot of stories start like this. I had a friend who was going back and forth in the Balkans because of her work. She was working in a French NGO. And so she kept on talking about this region quite a lot. And I realized how little I knew about it. But I had this very, very simple question in my mind, which was, how do you live with the memory of the war 20 years after? because 20 years is quite a long time if you take an individual, but on a society's level, it's a very, very short time. And 20 years after, you still have a lot of living memories, let's say. So how do you deal with that? So it was quite a naive question.
Mm-hmm.
So it was with that question that I first went to Bosnia in 2010. And that's how it started. The very, very start of this story is not told in the book, because the very, very start of the story was a discussion with Mirella, who was a child during the war and whose family fled to France. And I met her in Sarajevo during the very first trip. And I explained this question to her. And she looked at me and she said, we were talking in French. She said, "Why do you think people will talk to you?" And I answered there are absolutely no reason why people would talk to me unless they want to or they need to. And that's it. And so she started to talk, and she talked for hours, and she told me her story and the story of her family, the story of the village she grew up in, which is a village of Ternopolje. I made a web documentary about that village.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, she said, "Well, if you come back, you can come to my village and I'll present you to some people." So of course I came back. That's how it started the very first time. And that's how I met Senem the first time, because very, very quickly I realized how big of an issue the missing were. You cannot talk about the past in Bosnia without talking about the missing. Everyone either has someone in his or her own family who went missing, or knows someone who went missing, or knows someone who has someone who went missing. I mean, it concerns absolutely everyone in this country. So that's how it started.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know by then that it would go on for years.
So you started to get interested in this area because of your friend, but you didn't go to Bosnia in order to write a book, but you were planning on creating documentaries as a filmmaker. In your book, you mentioned the web documentary Ternopolje, On été oublié, that came out in 2012, as well as the documentary film that was released 2020 under the title Parler avec les morts, talking with the dead. So these projects came before your book. Can you talk about these films?
Yes, well, actually, when I went to Bosnia for the very first time, I was there as a journalist. So I didn't even have the project of doing a documentary, the web documentary. It's just that during this first trip, that was the second trip, actually. Mm-hmm. I met a lot of people who told me their stories and the stories of their families, the stories of the missing. And that's how the idea of making a web documentary started, about this village called Ternopolje. Ternopolje is a small village, about 2,000 people were living in there by then, in 92, when the war started. And the school of the village was transformed into a camp. So all the persons who were not Serbs, so basically Bosniaks and some Croats, were brought into that camp, the men, and the children, the women, and elderly people were sent away from that region. So that was the start of the ethnic cleansing of the Bosnian War in April 92. Mm-hmm. So way before Srebrenica. And so during that first trip to that village, there were several people who told me their stories that were all linked to this school. And that's how the idea of making a web documentary about that school and about the stories that are around the school started. And then the second film, Talking with the Dead in English, or Parler avec les morts, started when there was a mass grave discovered in that region in 2013. I went to that mass grave and I spent a week there watching the work of the forensic team, which was digging the grave, including Senem, who I already knew. And then I wanted to go on with the story of that grave. Actually, that mass grave was discovered because someone talked. Someone said the mass grave is here in that place, and that's how it was discovered, and there were remains of hundreds of peoples that were digged out of that grave. And what I was interested in at the beginning was the silence, which I already had experienced during all the previous trips to Bosnia, and the silence that someone decides to break and tell, okay, the grave is here. But that obviously is very difficult to film because the person who had talked was protected. It was not possible to meet the person who had talked, so how do you do with a film with that? And at the same time, I had been watching people at work for a week. For me, it was a long time, but I knew that for them it was a very short time because they were working on that mass grave for several months. And that's how the idea of telling about the missing through the work of those who have done this for years, like Senem and Daria, that's how the idea started. I had these two women that I had met by then. I had, for Senem, followed in her work already, so I knew what it was about. Well, that's how the idea of the film arose. Talking about the work, the very, very long work that it is to look for the missing, and why this work is still important to do even 20, 25, 30 years after what happened. And even though we know that not everyone can be found, but why it is important to do the work. And I think for me, by that point, it was also important not to be the one that would be asking the questions in front of the families, because I had done that. For the first web documentary, I had done that a lot, talking to the families of the missing, and I knew how painful it could be for them to talk about what happened, and how after the interview, I just go away, and they stay with everything that, my questions brought up again. And I didn't want to do that again. So filming Daria in her work was a way to approach this story without me asking the questions, and just, observing and following their work.
Mm-hmm. In an interview I saw on YouTube, I learned that you didn't think about writing a book about your time in Bosnia at first. In fact, you were initially against taking on such a project. Can you talk about how this book came about, and also about your initial reservations?
Yeah, so I didn't think about a book at any point during those 10 years or more that I went back and forth to Bosnia, because I was working in a completely different form. I was working on this web documentary and then on a documentary. And for me, it was enough. Let's put it this way. Actually, the idea of writing a book came out when I met my publisher and editor, Cyril Gué, from Marchali, a small publishing house that does only nonfiction books. And I went to see him with completely another project, which I was starting by that time. And I talked about this film that I had just finished editing, and which was coming out soon, about Bosnia. And he was the one who told me, you should write a book also. I was not convinced. Maybe just because I had just finished, doing the editing, and it was doing this film was a 5-year project, so it was a long time. And I wanted to move on to some other stories. But he insisted, and he said, yeah, you should really think about it. I really think you have a book in there. So I thought about it, and I finally told him, okay, I will try. And actually, he was right. So he's a very good publisher. He knew before I knew. And so the book was written in 2020 during the COVID year. It was like digging in my own archives, the writing, because I had to go back 10 years before, and I had to go back to the state of mind where I was 10 years before. And luckily, I have quite a lot of archives. I write when I'm on the field. I write a lot. I have like these notebooks, and I had recordings. I had photographs. Of course, I had all the material, the film material as well. So I went back to all that. And actually the writing was quite easy. It was easier than I thought. And well, at the end, yes, there was a book.
So books and films are, of course, very different genres, very different forms of expression. How does working on them differ, or what makes the biggest difference for you? And what can you show or tell in a book that you can't do in a movie, and vice versa? Because it is kind of the same, I mean, not the same, but a similar story you're telling in the book.
It
right?
is. It is. Actually, there are several scenes in the book that you have in the film as well, but they're not exactly the same scenes, though. The same things are happening, but not exactly the same things. I don't know how to put this.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you can do in a book that you cannot do in a film is that you create the images afterwards. When you do a film, the images, I mean, you have to shoot them when you are there. And the type of films that I do are quite, like in French, you say cinéma direct, like very direct scenes. There is absolutely no voiceover. So it's really like shooting what you have in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And then all the storytelling happens in the editing. But when you write, you create that afterwards. So you have more distance, I guess, to what you are telling. That's maybe the first difference. I think also that doing documentary films has influenced a lot my writing. I have started doing these documentary films in 2010. Then I went to a filmmaking course in a film school, so I really started to learn how to do it and wanted to know more about it, and that influenced my writing also. I mean that in my writing you also can have images quite a lot, and yet it's not the same thing. So I think it also maybe it speaks to the readers or to the audience in a different way. What I like in filmmaking is that the images are so I don't know how you say that in English actually. Immediate, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So you can tell a lot of things in the way that you shoot the image, in the way that you do the editing, and how you receive the image is very different of how you receive the words as a reader or as an audience.
And speaking of images, in your book you talk a lot about photos and video footage, also because you comment on making your documentary. But apart from a map of the region, there are no photos in your book. Is that because you wanted to make a clear cut between book and film, or are there other reasons? I mean, I had to think of Susan Sontag's Regarding the Pain of Others a lot, which is about war photography, and Sontag devotes herself to iconic images, but never shows any of them in the book.
I didn't want any images, and well, it's also a discussion with the publisher, of course, and their books are usually this way. There are no images in there.
Mm-hmm.
I have also done other books with photographers where you have a story told by the images and a story told by words, and usually they complete. It's kind of two ways of telling the same story and not telling exactly the same things. So I didn't feel that in this book version I needed the images, because the images were already there. Maybe the images were inside me and they were part of the material that I was working on when I was writing the book. So I didn't feel you needed to have any kind of image. And actually, I don't know what they would have brought up more to the story in that book version, I mean. Maybe because I had this previous experience about working with photographers and with, imagining books where you have photographs and you have text. And I knew what you can do with that. And this time I didn't feel we needed any. I didn't, for instance, because we could have used, photographs of Senem and Daria.
Mm-hmm.
But why would I do that? I didn't feel any kind of reason, because they exist. You don't need the photo to make them exist. And you don't need a photograph of a mass grave to make it exist. What I tried to do with the book is to take the readers with me to the places where I go. And you can do that with words. And I think it's more powerful sometimes to do it with words and let the reader, do the work of imagination. I don't know if this is very clear.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. And so you meet a lot of people, or you met a lot of people on your trips. You also mentioned these conversations in your book, but you mainly focus on the two women, Senem and Daria, who work for the ICMP, the International Commission of Missing Persons. And you kind of already explained why you chose to focus on them and not to focus on the families who are searching for their missing relatives. But could you explain what these two women actually do, their field of activity?
Well, Senem works with the dead and Daria works with the living. So Senem is a forensic anthropologist, which means that she will go to the mass graves, dig out the human remains, sort them out, analyze them, try to put them in the right anatomical order. She will also do the sampling, the bone sampling, which means that you take a small part of the bone, which is then sent to a DNA lab, and then you have a DNA profile of the human remains. She will also try to figure out whether the bones that are found in the mass grave are part of the same person or not. So it's a very, very precise work where you have to make the bones talk in a way. Whereas Daria, she's working with the living. So she's working with the families of the missing. She will go and meet them. She will ask them questions about the moment where the person went missing, about what he or she was wearing, about a number of physical details, about if the person had injuries before, what kind of teeth he had, and so on. So she has like this very long questionnaire that she fills out with the persons. And what she will do after that is to make a blood sample. So she will collect 4 drops of blood that will then be sent to another DNA lab, which will then, from the blood sample, will have a DNA profile. And then those 2 DNA profiles will be put in a huge databases. And the databases will then tell if there is a match between the living and between the dead. So you have like these 2 persons, and that's what I also found interesting for the story and for the storytelling, is that you have these 2 parts of the work. You have the dead and you have the living. And what Senem and Daria actually, what they are trying to do with their work is try to make the dead connect with the living connect with the dead, which is something that we take for granted usually, because, not all of us are experiencing what this means when you have someone missing. Usually when a person dies, you have funerary ritual, whatever that is. You have funerals, whatever form it takes, and then you have a grave, or you have ashes that are spread somewhere. You have this ritual, so you know what is happening, and the fact that the person is dead is very clear. You have material evidence of it. When someone is missing, you don't. Everything of all this is missing as well. You don't know whether the person is living or dead. I mean, sometimes you have information. So if you are trying to, like, rationally speaking, you know that the person is dead. But when you don't have any kind of, you don't have anything to bury, how do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think humans need the material evidence of the death in order to be able to accept it. I think this is something that is, completely common to all of us. And so Senem and Daria are trying to repair that link, that bond between the living and the dead that has been broken when someone has gone missing. And that has been broken on purpose, actually. Because it's not these people go missing because they have been executed, they have been shot, they have been killed in a place, and then other people have decided that their bodies should be hidden and buried in a mass grave. So this is done on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find the concept of repair in your book very interesting. You use this verb in order to describe what Senem and Daria do, restoring the bond between life and dead, and giving the dead back a piece of dignity. And you don't only use the word repair. What was also very interesting, I think, is that the moment you describe what they do, looking at the factory building where Senem works, you write that you are overwhelmed by your feelings and you want to, quote, capture the beauty of everything that is happening here, everything that is being repaired here. So the concept of beauty in relation to the hall and the horrible smell I found very interesting. Can you explain why you talk or use the term beauty?
I think it's the beauty of their work and the beauty of that act or that gesture. Senem works with her hands. And when I filmed Senem's work, because I started filming with her, even though she's not in the final film, because she then went to work in Afghanistan. But I started to film with her, and I filmed a lot her hands. You know, the gestures that she has with the bones, that she tries to put them in an order. She tries to figure out a story in something that has been destroyed. And I think that was beautiful. And what is done in that factory building, which can be really smelly and not a nice place to come in for the first time. But for her, it's her workplace. And she goes, she went there every morning. And she went there again and again and again and doing the same gestures again and again and again, trying to bring the families this very short moment, because it's a very short moment actually when the families are being told that, okay, now we have found your beloved one. His or her body is here. You will be able to bury it. You know, it's not that big thing. I don't know how to say it. It's a very short moment, but actually it's a very important moment. Like Senem says herself, it's like putting, how do you say this in English? I have trouble finding my words. A dot, do you say a dot at the end of the sentence? Yeah, she says it this way. It's like putting an end to a sentence that has been going on for 15 years and you have been waiting to, like, putting an end to the story. Being the one who will, putting some kind of closure, bringing some kind of closure to the families. I think that's how you say it in English. And the beauty is there. And that's what I started to see in that place. Of course, when I went there for the first time, that was not what I saw. The first time that I went there, I remember it very clearly, and I tell it in the book. What I saw was, oh my God, dead bodies. I don't know. I've never been in this place. Actually, what I saw in the first place was my own trouble and my own, trouble in the sense of an emotion, in the sense of what am I doing here? What I saw was my own relation to death. And I came back a lot of times. So what I started to see were some other things. And I've seen that place in very different situations. I have also seen that place when the families come in just before the collective funerals and when they see the place for the first time. And, the feeling in the place completely changes in that moment. It's a place of grief and sorrow. It's not a place of work. And yeah, I think that's what I meant with the beauty. It's the beauty of those who do that work endlessly for year after year after year in order to give that moment to the families.
And coming back to the work of Senem and Daria, in your book you describe all these little steps and tasks of these two women very precisely, down to the smallest detail. Also places like the mass grave in Tomashica, in the factory building where Senem works. Why do you put so much focus on these details? Why do you explain every single work step with so much accuracy?
I think those details are important in order to understand where they work, how they work. It's also important because it's a way to bring the readers with me to those places.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to make those places real and living for them. It's a way to tell them, okay, come with me and you will look with me at all these small details. It's also the way that I work when I am on the field, is that I do observe these little details, because it's a way of really being where you are and looking at these small things. And usually they do tell part of the story. They do tell actually quite a big part of the story, because the stories are not just the words that people tell you. It's just not the facts that people tell you or the facts that you see or things that happen. It's also all these small things that we live in, that surround us. One of the things that filmmaking has brought to me is paying more and more attention to these small details, and how sometimes they can tell a lot of things. I mean, when I'm with Daria in a family, in the house of the family, and how the living room looks like, things are where they should be. It's very neat and organized, and I don't know, maybe someone has put flowers there, and those kind of little things. I think they tell a lot about not just the places, but also about the people.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, for instance, Senem that comes in the factory in the morgue, and she has her coffee with her. For me, it's important because that tells something of her relation to that place. Of course, I couldn't go in there with my coffee, even
Mm-hmm.
though she told me, please come, and I had my coffee, I needed to put it down. And that small detail tells a lot about her relation to that place and my relation to that place, which is not the same.
I have another question, but you probably give me the same answer that you just gave me, because it's not only the small details concerning the work, it's also their everyday life of these two women and others. And you just mentioned the coffee. I was a bit amused how much coffee was consumed or in your book, and how many cigarettes are smoked.
Yes. Well, you do drink a lot of coffee and you do smoke a lot of cigarettes. I mean, I don't smoke, but sometimes when I'm in Bosnia, I do smoke. It's a way of being together, I guess. There is also quite a lot of rakia that is being offered and consumed also. The moment where you drink the coffee and the moment where you smoke your cigarettes are the moments, the moments when you come back to the everyday life. Because during the interview, for instance, when we are with Daria, during the interview, the people that she has in front of us are just, they go back to the past, and they have to dig all these things out, and it can be painful. It can be difficult for them. There can be a lot of emotion, or not emotion on that very moment, but there is emotion afterwards. And, the moment when you lit up the cigarette, and that's the moment when you kind of come back to reality of today. And it's also the moments where sometimes important things are said, or not important things, like, I have some burek for you. Would you take it with you? It's a small thing, and at the same time, for me, it's an important thing, because it tells about how Daria's work is being appreciated. It tells about the hospitality of these people. It tells about the hospitality of this community, which has gone through all these absolutely horrific things, where neighbors could just become enemies. It tells another part of the story.
Mm-hmm. And these gestures are, of course, very important, because you don't speak Bosnian, or just a little bit, I think. But of course, you follow Daria and Senem with their work, and so you meet a lot of families that you at first don't understand. Some of the conversations you record were translated to you only afterwards. How did this impact your work?
When I first started to work with the missing and met the first families of the missing, I had an interpreter with me. So it was like, those were stories that were told with words. So I did understand in that way. I mean, for instance, for the web documentary Thermopylae, En été oublié, all the film is based on very long interviews with the three main characters. And I had an interpreter with me. So I was working with words. I knew what could be said. I knew what kind of stories these could be. But when I was working with Daria, I was shooting the film. So I didn't need to understand. In a way, I didn't need to understand. In the way that, anyway, what I was looking for in the film was all the things that are in there, but that are not in the words. The way that the room just fills up with memories and emotions, and not a lot might be said in the words. So that was what I was looking for. And when I was shooting the documentary, I was doing the sound. So I was recording the sound, and I had a colleague who was behind the camera, and he didn't understand a word of Bosnian. He understood even less than I did.
Mm-hmm.
He had to rely on things that he could just see. And that was exactly what I was looking for during that film. It's the things that you cannot, that are not in the words. Let's put it this way. So now I lost your question. I can't remember what you asked me.
No, I think we're good. The problem is that I don't really know how to make a question out of my next thing that I want to talk about. Because speaking of talking to other people, you mentioned self-censorship, not using certain words like mass graves or ethnic cleansing. You talk about incidents that have happened. So you notice lots of people do not want to talk about what was happening in the 90s. And at the same time, you notice a lot of nationalism and historical revisionism in the region, like a very loud denial. So that lots of silence and lots of...
It's a loud silence, I think. This is
yes,
very
a very loud... Yeah, it's a very
Yeah.
loud silence.
Yeah. The region where I have been working in Bosnia for the films and for the book is the region of Prijedor, which is situated not very far from the Croatian border. And it's situated on the territory of Republika Srpska. I mean, Bosnia-Herzegovina as a country is divided into two entities. You have the Federation, and then you have Republika Srpska, which is mainly a Serb part of Bosnia. I will not go into the details of how all this is organized because it's quite complicated. You have two presidencies, you have two assemblies, you have two possible sets of laws, and so on and so on. So what I want to say is that the region where I am filming and listening to people is a mainly Serb region today. It's a region where the ethnic cleansing started in April 92. So this is the very beginning of the war, actually. And it went on there years before what happened in Srebrenica, because usually people, what they remember from Bosnia is Srebrenica. And it's a region where there has been some trials, but not that many. And it's a region where the memory of ethnic cleansing and genocide is absolutely not recognized by the officials.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a region where Bosniaks have come back. Not all of them. There is a very big diaspora as well, but some of them have come back and they are trying to live together again. And I think, but this is a very personal and very subjective view, of course. What I felt there is that sometimes silence is the price to be paid in order to be able to live together again. It was something that I struggled against when I went there for the first time. I work basically mostly with words, and I do think that, telling a story of what happened is a way to recover. I am convinced of that. But the moment when that becomes possible is sometimes years and years afterwards, or sometimes maybe it's just not possible to put into words what you have gone through. I mean, it's not to me to judge on that or to say what is possible or not for this or this person. But what was very puzzling for me at the beginning in that region was that the silence was collective. It was a silence where everyone seemed to agree that we should not talk about these things. There were some activists who were engaged in organization and who tried to bring that memory alive, who tried to talk about it and who did great work in doing so. because they kept the memory alive and they fought against the thing that, everyone forgets. And those people are still there. We became friends, and I see them today, and they are starting to get really, really, really tired because they have been doing this job. They have been fighting against the silence for so many years. And yet what they feel is that nothing changes. And maybe the change cannot be seen now. Maybe the change will be seen, in a very long time. Or maybe what the difference that they have made, although they don't see the difference themselves, is that this story has still been living on, even though there is this very, very loud silence. And it will go on. It will go living on because stories have been told, because, I don't know, films have been made, books have been written, and those kind of things, they stay. And that's maybe the hope that I have for my own work, is that these stories, they go on. The book is being translated into several languages. It will be translated into 7 languages, which is huge. I didn't expect that at all. So the story moves on. And what actually happened last year is that the book was translated into Bosnian, and it was published in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Mm-hmm.
So now the book is available in the very language in which the story was told. That for me was very important also, that it goes on. But it's true that, the silence is something what I sometimes say is that all these years in Bosnia have taught to me how to listen to the silence, because silence can be very loud, and silence can tell a lot of things also. And when I write in the book about Mehmet, with whom I just drink coffee in the morning and watch the cows and watch the garden. And he teaches me how to say cow in Bosnian.
Mm-hmm.
For me, those are very important moments, because I think what Mehmet told me is really how to listen to silence. Mehmet never told me his story. Never, ever. Actually, he had lived through the war. He had been made a prisoner in the camps. He had suffered what he had suffered, witnessed a lot of things too. And then he had a car accident after the war, and he lost his memory. So he lost a lot of other things too, but he lost his memory, and in a way that was a blessing, maybe at that point for him. So sometimes forgetting, can be also a blessing. I think it's all these, I went to Bosnia with a very naive question, and I came back with a lot more questions. And basically just sometimes silence is fine, and sometimes silence is a blessing, and sometimes not. But you never know, actually.
Mm-hmm. And you already kind of gave the answer to my next question, because in the book you mentioned that there is hardly any reporting on the work of the ICMP and other organization, and Senem Odaria, I forgot who does, mentions that at one point that you were the first journalist to report on their work, and now you tell me that your book has in fact been translated into Bosnian. Did you hear any kind of reaction to your films or your book? Do you know how it is received in the area?
The web documentary that we did, I say we because we were 3 persons working on that.
Mm-hmm.
We showed it in Ternopolje, even before we showed it anywhere else. So the very, very first screening happened in Ternopolje, and we had 200 people who came to see the documentary, and none of them was Serb. Although, the inhabitants of the village knew that there was this screening, but they didn't come. That's also the reason why this is a web documentary, which means that it could be, it's not online anymore, but it could be seen on the internet. And so you could just watch it in your house, in your home, and not in public. And that was a very special moment, because it was the first time for these people who had talked to us because of the film. It was the first time that their story became public, and it came public in their own village. And it was their version of the story. And I remember Nejad told us that he was happy with this film because now he could just show the film to his kids. He had not really talked about what happened to his children by then. but now he could just, watch the film with them. And so it would be easier. So that's the kind of moment that I think, okay, this work has importance and it has value, not for me, but for the people who agree on telling their story. It has value for them for reasons which are bigger than the film itself. And when the book was published, I was in Sarajevo last summer in a literary festival where the book was presented. So I was in front of a completely Bosnian audience. I was very, very nervous before because I had absolutely no idea how this could be received. I mean, I'm not Bosnian. I've not lived through the war myself. I'm a complete stranger in this story. I just went there for the first time and came back and tried to make something out of this story. And it was a very, very, very special moment. I had questions no one else had. Any other public had never asked me those kind of questions. And what people, I think, well, some of them came to talk to me afterwards and they told me basically the same thing. Thank you for coming back. Because I think a lot of times we journalists, we go to a place, we listen to people, we take a story and then we try to tell it somewhere else, but we don't come back. And for the people who have given their stories and who have shared their stories and who have accepted to share their stories, which can be very intimate, personal and painful stories, it's a bit weird, we don't come back. And that's what people were telling me. Thank you for coming back and thank you for trying to tell this story. And maybe what I understood by that time also was that, making a book, writing a book is something that stays. The story is kind of fixed in the book. So even though people who don't talk about these stories together, they are in the book. So they can be shared through the book or through a film. And maybe that's the purpose of telling these stories and trying to tell them in that form. And that's maybe the purpose of my work, is trying to tell the stories in a form that then will live its own life and will also go back to the people that have shared their stories or to the people who in a way or another are connected with these stories and who are interested in them, who have a concern in them. And maybe that's a way to break the silence. I don't know. This sounds very pretentious, but, a way to give the stories a possibility to go on with their lives and heal people if it's the time for that.
And we have to come to an end, and I want to finish with two last questions. In 2014, you attended a funeral service in Kozarac, and which took place in a stadium, and the entire football field was full of coffins. And at the side of the many visitors and family, you write, "I finally gave up my journalistic view." Can you talk about this particular moment and above all, what characterizes a journalistic view after all? Is it a certain distance or objectivity that was no longer there? And maybe the form of the reportage also allows you to get personal, which you do and to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think what was very clear by that moment is that I was not with the journalists. I was not, physically, I was not with them because it was a very big collective funeral. There was a lot of press, there were journalists, TV cameras and so on. And they were actually very close. And it's funny that we talk about distance, when we talk about journalism, but physically these cameras and the journalists were very close to the coffins, very close to the families and, in a place that was not mine anymore. My place was not there. My place was somewhere else. Maybe my place by that time was with the families, because actually that summer when I came to Bosnia, it was the first time that I came to Bosnia and without knowing what I was doing there. I didn't come there because I was doing a film. I didn't go there because I was doing a journalistic piece or anything. I went there because I wanted to be I wanted to be there because I had seen these bodies come out of the earth and I wanted to see them go back to the earth in a decent way. So it was a very personal reason. I don't know why. It was, actually Senem told me, you are being loyal to the victims. Mm-hmm. That's how she put it. And I think in a way she was right. I wouldn't I couldn't have put it myself into words, but that's how she put it into words. And maybe it was that, I wanted to witness the moment where the bodies can rest in peace. That was the reason why I was there. So I was quite far, actually, physically. I was quite far from, I was outside the football stadium, actually, at that particular moment. So I was watching from there. But I was with Mirela's family, with Mehmed, and I was with the people. That was also the moment when I realized, or let's say that was the stay during which I realized that part of the stories that I have been listening to for several years by then were becoming part of me in a very humble way. But I was dreaming about these stories, and I was when I was dreaming about these stories, I was inside them. I was a character of the stories. I was not just listening. I was inside. And I couldn't write about these stories anymore as a journalist after that. Doing a documentary film is not exactly the same thing as writing as a journalist.
My last question is very close to the one I just asked you. I find it very interesting that not only your characters undergo a certain development in your book, but also you as an author. One notices that your relationship with the country and the people change. And I was a little bit confused at first because when you start your book, you describe the landscape as quite bleak. The weather is bad. It's cold and constantly foggy. There is often talk about the unemployment or lack of prospects in this area. But as the book progresses, the region becomes more and more beautiful. You describe the hospitality and the food and friendly encounters. Also, the weather gets much nicer. So can you talk about what you kind of already started, your personal development in these 10 years, and your relationship with this area?
I think the biggest thing that changed for me during these years is that I don't ask questions anymore. When I first went there, I went there as a journalist. So, that's basically the job. You will ask questions and people then will answer or not. But your job is to ask questions. When I go there now, I don't ask that many questions. I listen to the silence. And I think that is the biggest thing that changed for me. I think maybe it's true that it's very foggy in the beginning of the story because we're in October, and then I come back during summertime, so it's nicer. It's very hot, but it's weather is nicer. But maybe what changed also, in the story, is that with Daria, I go into the homes of the families. I am in their intimacy. I'm inside the houses much more than I am with Senem, obviously, because with Senem, I am mostly in the factory, in the morgue, or on the mass grave. The only house that I enter with Senem is her home. So, and with Daria, I enter a lot of homes. I'm on the road. I'm in the car with her, or we are in the homes of the people that she goes and meets. So that might explain, the evolution in the book, in the story. Of course, my relation to the country has changed a lot because now I have friends there. I go back to Bosnia once a year, even though I don't have any kind of story to tell for the moment from there. So I do meet Daria and Senem again because now, if Senem is on her holidays, she might be in Bosnia. So I've met there 2, 3, 4 times. I can't remember after the book has been published. I don't know how to describe my relation to the country because I don't have a family there. I have never lived in there yet. For me, it's a familiar place now. It's a place where I do feel at home, even though I don't speak the language, or I speak it very, very little and very bad. But it's a place where I feel at home. Really, the feeling is that one, I feel at home. I have friends, and I'm looking for another story. to tell from that country. I don't know whether it will be possible or not, but the story that I would like to work on now is the story of these very little small anecdotes that every victim has to tell about his or her experience during the war. These anecdotes of someone who is supposed to be the enemy, and at some point this person does something that maybe sometimes saves your life. Or you have a small gesture of kindness from someone who is supposed to be your enemy, or from someone who could kill you, basically, to put it, in a very clear way. And sometimes this gesture of kindness saves your life. Sometimes it's just a gesture of kindness without these kind of very dramatic consequences. And I've heard a lot of these stories, and the question that I have is, how do you make that choice? So I'm not being in the point of view of the victim, but in the point of view of the person who makes the choice to be kind or to have that gesture at that very moment. What does that choice mean? Why do you make it? How do you make it? How do you deal with it? So that basically means that what I would like to do is to meet the persons who could be the perpetrators during war, and to make them talk about these kind of moments. So obviously this is not an easy task, and I don't know whether it's possible or not, but that's my wish.
Mm-hmm. So Taina, thank you so much for talking to me today and answering my questions.
Thank you. I hope you have enough material.